Section 29 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 29. But was it Lady Bruton, whom she used to know? Was it Peter Walsh grown grey? Lady Rossiter asked herself, who had been Sally Seton. It was old Miss Parry, certainly, the old aunt who used to be so cross when she stayed at Burton. Never should she forget running along the passage naked and being sent for by Miss Parry. And Clarissa, oh, Clarissa! Sally caught her by the arm. Clarissa stopped beside them. "But I can't stay," she said. "I shall come later. Wait," she said, looking at Peter and Sally. They must wait, she meant, until all these people had gone. "I shall come back," she said, looking at her old friends Sally and Peter, who were shaking hands, and Sally, remembering the past no doubt, was laughing. But her voice was wrung of its old ravishing richness, her eyes not aglow as they used to be when she smoked cigars, when she ran down the passage to fetch her sponge bag without a stitch of clothing on her. And Ellen Atkins asked what if the gentleman had met her? But everybody forgave her. She stole a chicken from the larder because she was hungry in the night. She smoked cigars in her bedroom. She left a priceless book in the punt. But everybody adored her, except perhaps Papa. It was her warmth, her vitality. She would paint, she would write. Old women in the village never to this day forgot to ask after your friend in the red cloak who seemed so bright. She accused Hugh Whitbread of all people, and there he was, her old friend Hugh, talking to the Portuguese ambassador, of kissing her in the smoking room to punish her for saying that women should have votes. Vulgar men did, she said. And Clarissa remembered having to persuade her not to denounce him at family prayers, which she was capable of doing with her daring, her recklessness, her melodramatic love of being at the centre of everything, and creating scenes, and it was bound, Clarissa used to think, to end in some awful tragedy, her death, her martyrdom, instead of which she had married, quite unexpectedly, a bald man with a large buttonhole who owned, it was said, cotton mills at Manchester. And she had 5 boys! She and Peter had settled down together. They were talking. It seemed so familiar that they should be talking. They would discuss the past. With the two of them, more even than with Richard, she shared her past. The garden, the trees, old Joseph Brettkopf singing Brahms without any voice, the drawing-room wallpaper, the smell of the mats. A part of this Sally must always be, Peter must always be. But she must leave them. There were the Bradshaws whom she disliked. She must go up to Lady Bradshaw, in grey and silver, balancing like a sea lion at the edge of its tank, barking for invitations, duchesses, the typical successful man's wife. She must go up to Lady Bradshaw and say... But Lady Bradshaw anticipated her. "We are shockingly late, dear Mrs. Dalloway. We hardly dared to come in," she said. And Sir William, who looked very distinguished, with his grey hair and blue eyes, said yes. They had not been able to resist the temptation. He was talking to Richard about that bill, probably, which they wanted to get through the Commons. Why did the sight of him talking to Richard curl her up? He looked what he was, a great doctor, a man absolutely at the head of his profession, very powerful, rather worn. For think what cases came before him, people in the uttermost depths of misery, people on the verge of insanity, husbands and wives. He had to decide questions of appalling difficulty. Yet what she felt was... one wouldn't like Sir William to see one unhappy. No, not that man. "How is your son at Eton?" she asked Lady Bradshaw. He had just missed his 11, said Lady Bradshaw, because of the mumps. His father minded even more than he did, she thought, being, she said, nothing but a great boy himself. Clarissa looked at Sir William, talking to Richard. He did not look like a boy, not in the least like a boy. She had once gone with someone to ask his advice. He had been perfectly right, extremely sensible. But heavens, what a relief to get out to the street again! There was some poor wretch sobbing, she remembered, in the waiting-room. But she did not know what it was about Sir William. What exactly she disliked. Only Richard agreed with her. Didn't like his taste, didn't like his smell. But he was extraordinarily able. They were talking about this bill. Some case, Sir William was mentioning, lowering his voice. It had its bearing upon what he was saying about the deferred effects of shell shock. There must be some provision in the bill. Sinking her voice, drawing Mrs. Dalloway into the shelter of a common femininity, a common pride in the illustrious qualities of husbands and their sad tendency to overwork, Lady Bradshaw, poor goose, one didn't dislike her, murmured how, just as we were starting, my husband was called upon the telephone. A very sad case. A young man, that is what Sir William is telling Mr. Dalloway, had killed himself. He had been in the army. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death. she thought. She went on into the little room where the Prime Minister had gone with Lady Bruton. Perhaps there was somebody there, but there was nobody. The chairs still kept the impress of the Prime Minister and Lady Bruton. She turned deferentially, he sitting foursquare authoritatively. They had been talking about India. There was nobody. The party's splendour fell to the floor. So strange it was to come in alone in her finery. What business had the Bradshaws to talk of death at her party? A young man had killed himself, and they talked of it at her party. The Bradshaws talked of death. He had killed himself. But how? Always her body went through at first when she was told, suddenly, of an accident. Her dress flamed, her body burnt. He had thrown himself from a window. Up had flashed the ground, through him, blundering, bruising, went the rusty spikes. There he lay with a thud, thud, thud in his brain, and then a suffocation of blackness. So she saw it. But why had he done it? And the Bradshaws talked of it at her party. She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine, never anything more. But he had flung it away. They went on living. She would have to go back. The rooms were still crowded. People kept on coming. All day she had been thinking of Burton, of Peter, of Sally. They would grow old. A thing there was that mattered, a thing, wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate, people feeling the impossibility of reaching the centre, which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart, rapture faded, one was alone. There was an embrace in death. But this young man who had killed himself, had he plunged holding his treasure? If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, she had said to herself once, coming down in white. Or there were the poets and thinkers. Suppose he had had that passion and had gone to Sir William Bradshaw, a great doctor, yet to her obscurely evil, without sex or lust, extremely polite to women, but capable of some indescribable outrage, forcing your soul. That was it. If this young man had gone to him, and Sir William had impressed him like that with his power, might he not then have said, indeed she felt it now, life is made intolerable. They make life intolerable, men like that. Then, she had felt it only this morning, there was the terror, the overwhelming incapacity, one's parents giving it into one's hands, this life, to be lived to the end, to be walked with serenely. There was, in the depths of her heart, an awful fear. Even now, quite often if Richard had not been there reading the Times, so that she could crouch like a bird and gradually revive, send roaring up that immeasurable delight, rubbing stick to stick, one thing with another, she must have perished. But that young man had killed himself. Somehow it was her disaster, her disgrace. It was her punishment to see sink and disappear, here a man, there a woman, in this profound darkness. And she, forced to stand here in her evening dress. She had schemed, she had pilfered. She was never wholly admirable. She had wanted success, Lady Bexborough and the rest of it, and once she had walked on the terrace at Burton. It was due to Richard. She had never been so happy. Nothing could be slow enough, nothing last too long. No pleasure could equal, she thought, straightening the chairs, pushing in one book on the shelf, this having done with the triumphs of youth, lost herself in the process of living, to find it, with a shock of delight, as the sun rose, as the day sank. Many a time had she gone at Burton when they were all talking, to look at the sky, or seen it between people's shoulders at dinner, seen it in London when she could not sleep. She walked to the window. It held, foolish as the idea was, something of her own in it, this country sky, this sky above Westminster. She parted the curtains. She looked. Oh, but how surprising! In the room opposite, the old lady stared straight at her. She was going to bed. And the sky. It will be a solemn sky, she had thought. It will be a dusky sky, turning away its cheek in beauty. But there it was, ashen, pale, raced over quickly by tapering vast clouds. It was new to her. The wind must have risen. She was going to bed in the room opposite. It was fascinating to watch her, moving about, that old lady, crossing the room, coming to the window. Could she see her? It was fascinating, with people still laughing and shouting in the drawing-room, to watch that old woman, quite quietly, going to bed. She pulled the blind now. The clock began striking. The young man had killed himself, but she did not pity him. With the clock striking the hour, 1, 2, 3, she did not pity him, with all this going on. There, the old lady had put out her light. The whole house was dark now with this going on, she repeated, and the words came to her. Fear no more the heat of the sun. She must go back to them. But what an extraordinary night! She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. The clock was striking. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. He made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun. But she must go back. She must assemble. She must find Sally and Peter. And she came in from the little room. "But where is Clarissa?" said Peter. He was sitting on the sofa with Sally. After all these years, he really could not call her Lady Rossiter. "Where's the woman gone to?" he asked. "Where's Clarissa?" Sally supposed, and so did Peter for the matter of that there were people of importance, politicians, whom neither of them knew unless by sight in the picture papers, whom Clarissa had to be nice to, had to talk to. She was with them. Yet there was Richard Dalloway not in the cabinet. He hadn't been a success, Sally supposed. For herself, she scarcely ever read the papers. She sometimes saw his name mentioned. But then, well, she lived a very solitary life in the wilds, Clarissa would say, among great merchants, great manufacturers, men, after all, who did things. She had done things too. "I have 5 sons," she told him. Lord, Lord, what a change had come over her! The softness of motherhood, its egotism too. Last time they met, Peter remembered, had been among the cauliflowers in the moonlight. The leaves, like rough bronze, she had said, with her literary turn, and she had picked a rose. She had marched him up and down that awful night, after the scene by the fountain. He was to catch the midnight train. Heavens, he had wept. End of section 29. Read by Hannah Dormer, London, 24th of October 2021.